Hi guys, welcome back to the CS Classroom. So today what we're going to learn how to do is to create shapes, erase them, and also move them around, which I'll just draw that again and then move it around like so. So in a previous tutorial, which I'd recommend you check out and is linked in the description, called Drawing Shapes, we kind of gave a brief introduction to the graph element. We're going to go through how the graph element works again, but I would recommend checking that out, as I said before. So let's just go ahead and get started. So first we're going to import PySimpleGUI as SG as usual. And then we're going to create an options layout. So we're just going to create a layout for this part, or for this part of the user interface. So we're going to say options layout equals, it's going to be a traditional 2D array, sg.text. We'll just say choose action just to be a bit shorter. Enable events equals true. Although we probably don't really need enable events for that one. And then we're going to specify our radio buttons right here. So we'll just say sg.radio, draw rectangles, one key equals rect, and enable events equals true, because we are going to be clicking on this one right here. So let's multiply that by 3, or copy like 2 other copies of that. And then we'll just change our settings. We'll say erase item. This one will give a key of erase, because based on when these are clicked, that's going to tell our graph element what we can do inside here. And then we will say move stuff. And that'll just be a move event. So those are kind of outlining our basic options that can be selected by the user. Part of the reason why we do this is additionally because there's not a very easy way to, sorry, I just got to move this square brace right up here. So we have 4 array elements in our 2D array. But one of the problems with this graph element, as opposed to like Pygame, is that there's not like a really good way to actually detect exactly where the shape is on the graph element. So that's why we're specifying these options. Again, like it's possible, but it would take a lot more legwork than you're going to want to put in to be able to just keep track of where every shape is on the graph element. Anyways, we're going to go ahead and create, so this was just the layout for our options right here. And we're going to go ahead and create the main layout that's going to contain our graph element, which again we did before in a previous video. So it's just going to be one, well actually it's going to be one graph element and then the column to hold this. So it's going to be sg.graph, and we're just going to specify a bunch of parameters for that as usual. So we'll say canvas size equals 400 by 400, so 400 horizontally and then vertically. Graph bottom left. So this is going to tell us where in the graph our bottom left boundary is going to be, basically where our bottom boundary is going to be. And we're just going to say 0, 0. So that means 0, 0 is going to be right about here. And then we're going to say graph upper, well, top right, 400 by 400. And this is just specifying, like our graph element could be much bigger than, it could be like 600 by 600. But this basically tells PySimpleGUI what our operational area is going to be, so where we can do stuff in that graph. Specify a key. That key is going to be graph. enable events equals true. Background color is going to be light blue. Again, it can be any color. I just recommend it's light or white, just so you can see what you're actually putting on the graph. And well, right down here, we'll put drag submits equals true. So enable events allows us to detect click events on the graph element, and drag events allows us to detect whenever the mouse is moving around the graph. So drag elements is for movement, enable elements is going to be for click. Sorry, it's not going to be drag elements, it's going to be drag submits equals true. So that allows us to detect the movement of the mouse. And now that we've done that, we're actually going to create a little column. We're going to say sg.column, or we can even just say call. And we're going to put our options layout in there. So this is going to go right here. So we've got our graph element and then our options element layout on the side. And okay, let's see. So we've got that. We want that right there. This is going to take up another one. Actually, rather, I think probably we're going to have this all in the same row. So this is all just going to be one array. So we'll have a graph element, comma, or column element, and that's all going to be on the same row. So that's going to be perfect right there. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to create our window object to hold all of this. So we'll say sg.window, simple square movement. Oh, let's call it simple square. Layout finalize equals true, which I'm honestly not really sure what that does, but I know it doesn't work without that. And margins 0, 0. And this allows us to have our clean graph element with our column next to it. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to create an event loop. But before we do that, what we want to do is create some variables outside of the event loop. And this is going to be fairly complex because when sort of doing these operations, there's a lot to deal with. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a variable called isBeingDragged to keep track of when something is being dragged in the graph element, or something is being moved around. So basically when the mouse is moving something around, a figure is being dragged. So what figure, meaning which one of these shapes is being dragged. And this is specified by an ID, an integer ID. But nevertheless, we're just going to make it none. Mouse down point. So in an action, this is going to keep track of the coordinate at which a click was done. So we click and we drag, the mouse down point would be that initial click. So we're going to have mouse down point, or we're going to say equals none. Normally that'd be a tuple. We're going to have end of drag point. Again, equals none, because that's just going to be a tuple with a coordinate. So it would look something like that, like 55, 67. That's what it would look like. And then we're going to have the most recently clicked point. Which is kind of self-explanatory, but we'll go through how that plays in a bit later here. And then we're going to create a variable called temporary rect. And what this is going to do is this is going to kind of aid us in the process of actually creating a rectangle. So I'm just going to go ahead and erase this right here. So when we create rectangles, we can kind of move it around and create them as we want. But when I'm moving this around and I haven't actually let the mouse go. So right now I'm clicking and I'm dragging I'm clicking and dragging to basically see how my rectangle is going to look. I haven't actually created the rectangle yet. But so all these rectangles that are created as I'm dragging, those are all held in temporary rectangle until we get the final rectangle. And now the mouse is up and I've stopped dragging, and temporary rectangle doesn't exist anymore. This is our final rectangle. So that temporary rectangle aids in that process. All right, so now let's let's talk about how we're going to do this. Like, this is probably one of the most complex sort of event sequences that I've created in PySimpleGUI, but I'm going to try to break it down as best as I can. Again, I actually took this from a website called Trinket, which I take a lot of my tutorials from actually, and I modify them and then I kind of walk through them. Part of the reason for that is because there's no way I would have known how to do this otherwise. It's just there's not enough resources on these kinds of complex applications for me to be able to easily figure these things out. Hence the reason I create these videos so that you guys can more easily learn how to do these things. I think the only way to do it otherwise would just be able to like read the documentation and to spend years trying to figure out how to do this stuff. So this is standard boilerplate. Event values equals window. I got to actually create window right up here. Equals window.read. And we're just getting our event and our values. We have if event is none, then exit or break, which allows us to just exit out of the window. Before I move on, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable to hold our graph element. So I'm going to say window equals window. Graph. So I stored this right here in the variable window. And I'm going to say, I'm just going to have a variable right here to hold this. This is going to allow us to directly access our graph element, which we created right here, and access any properties on this graph element, basically. So I had these lines of code, and now what I want to do is I want to actually just specify how the cursor is going to look. So basically the way it works is when you move stuff, we have this cursor right here that has like 4 arrows. When we're doing anything else, we have what's called a left pointer. So just like a normal pointer that you're used to, right? So I need to create that functionality before I do anything else. And I'm going to say if event equals move, then graph dot set cursor equals fleur. I don't know. It's a French word. And that fleur matches up with this one right here. It's like sort of 4-arrowed symbol. And then we're going to say elif event not event dot starts with graph, where graph is actually just referring to this right here. But what this is basically saying is that as soon as we select a different event, so as soon as we have an event that isn't move and that isn't just a click on, or isn't just something, a click or a movement on our graph. So as soon as we have something like erase or draw rectangles, then our cursor is going to change. So elif not event graph, then graph.setCursor. Cursor equals left PTR. Which is just left pointer, and that's just our usual cursor that we're used to. So anytime we move to erase item or draw rectangles, we're going to change our cursor because that is not move stuff, and that isn't just a click on the graph. Now this starts with right here. Is really just analyzing our event to see whether the beginning string has graph. So it's just looking to see if like any number of the first few characters in the string that specifies our event has this graph event in it. So if it doesn't and it's not moved, then we are switching to our regular cursor. So there we go, we just set the cursor, which is complex in and of itself, but hopefully that made sense. Let's type this right here. Okay, now that we've done that, let's move on. Okay, so I just cleared the graph element, and now we're going to get to the good part. So we're going to say if event equals graph. So we're going to handle what actually happens when someone clicks or drags or does anything on the graph element. And as part of that, actually, we're going to say elif event.ends with up. Or, I mean, realistically, what we could do is we could do graph we could do this because that's basically what we're looking for. But how it's going to work is we're going to check whether the user is just clicking or dragging on the graph element, or if they have stopped using the graph element. So if their mouse has basically, if they stopped clicking on the graph element. So this is when they click, when basically they're clicking down. So when they're holding basically the button on the mouse down while they're on the graph element. And this is what happens when they lift the button off. So when they're no longer clicking on the graph element. So what we're going to do now, I'm just going to do that, and we'll just do, for now, we'll just do something like, well, we'll just leave that blank. So right here, we're going to tackle the code for when the user is clicking down. So this could be clicking down, just clicking, or it could be dragging. So what we're going to do now is we are going to just deal with this first sort of event. We're going to say if not is being dragged. So what this is going to do, we're going to write for code, or so we're going to write for what happens when we transition to clicking. So basically, when the user first starts clicking and just doing stuff, this is the code that's going to be executed. We're going to say mouse down point. So it's going to be the last position where the mouse has touched the graph. And this xy is actually going to come from a line of code we need to put up here, which is going to be xy equals values graph. And that's going to get us the coordinate anytime the user is interacting on the graph. So they're clicking, they're dragging, whatever they're doing, we're going to get the coordinate for that. So this is basically what's happening right here is when if we start clicking and it's the first time, after it's the first time, so we had mouse up before or we just didn't do anything, and now we're transitioning back to clicking on the graph element. We're going to get the last point that happened with, and then we're going to say most recently click point. So I just want to clarify, like this is going to get triggered right here. Anytime after we've lifted the mouse up and we're going back to clicking, or we're just going into the graph element to do something. So we'll say most recently click point equals xy. So this is a tuple with the most recent coordinates. Or basically the coordinates we started with when we've just started our event. So right here, let's say we're doing draw rectangles. That right there, where we started right there, that's going to be mouse down point, most recently click point. We weren't dragging or doing anything before, and now we are. And then we're going to say is being dragged equals true. So we're just making that state clear. And then figures being dragged equals graph.get figures. So that's basically what shape are we working with. Because when we draw a rectangle or erase, which is what these really apply to, we're going to be interacting with some shape, with some figure or the other. So we'll say graph.get figures at location, and then we're going to get whatever figures at whatever coordinate our mouse is at that point. Now else, so if we're already in the state of dragging, so we drew a rectangle and we're moving stuff around, that's where this applies. So in that case, we're going to set end of drag point equals xy. So right here, we're getting our position when we started our movement or action. Here, every time we do a movement after that, where we're already in the state of being dragged, we're going to store that point at end of drag point. So that way, when we do stop our action, we have the last point that we were at. And then we're going to have if temporary rect. So this temporary rect is referring to any of these. So right here, basically how this works is I'm creating this rectangle. And when I'm moving it around here like this, I haven't created it yet. It's only when my mouse goes up that I've really created it. When I stop clicking that I've created it. So until then, we display these temporary rectangles that sort of delineate or show where we're intending to put a rectangle but haven't put it yet. And the temporary rectangle variable keeps track of that. We'll add to it later on. But if there's still a temporary rectangle, so if we're not done with our movement, we're going to say graph.deleteFigure, temporary rect, because whatever that is, it's only temporary, so we don't want that to necessarily stay there. It's just a temporary thing. We're also going to calculate xdiff, ydiff equals x minus most recently clicked point and y plus or y minus most recently clicked point. So this is the x coordinate of the most recently clicked point. So basically where we started our action, and this is going to be so that's going to be most recently clicked 0, and then we're going to have most recently clicked 1. So each of these represent the x and y coordinate of where we started our action, where we clicked down and started drawing a rectangle, or even where, well, actually not erasing, or we started moving something. So we started to move something around like so. And right here we have our current x and y coordinate. So xdiff and ydiff is going to basically just give us the difference between our current x and y coordinate and where we started the action on the graph. And notice this right here, this indentation, means it's not a part of this block of code or this block of code. This is just happening every single time we touch the graph, or we click down on the graph. So every single time we're getting the difference between where we are and where we were when we started whatever action it is that we're doing. Or whatever our last action was even, because what we're going to do right here is we're going to say most recently clicked point equals xy. Stores next point after. I'm just writing some comments here just to kind of make things clear, because this is a very complex process. Next point after initial start of action. So this is generally going to apply to a move or draw action, because that's really when movement is happening. This keeps track of difference between current mouse position and the beginning of any action So again, mainly we're talking about the move and draw actions. So yeah, I like to take some time and write these comments sometimes, because it helps also just pause a little bit so you guys can reflect on what it is we're doing here. And now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to say if mouse down point and end of drag point. So basically, if we've started some sort of dragging action, and we are in the middle of that, so we have an end of drag point. Okay, so we're either in the middle or we're at the end of that. So if these two things are true, we have points for both of these. Then we're going to do we're going to be able to do a few things. We're going to say if values move. So basically, if we are conducting a movement, we're moving something around, we wouldn't have values move if we didn't have that event happening, or if we didn't have that event selected. So we're going to say for figure, and figure is being dragged. Generally, we're actually only going to have one figure, but it's stored in a list, so we have to do this. Graph.moveFigure, figure x diff, y diff. So basically what this is doing is if we've selected move, this is going to say that we're going to move our current figure from our current figure, meaning like, for example, this rectangle right here, by an amount that's different from where we started the action to where our current position is, symbolized by x diff and y diff. Else if we are seeking to actually just create a rectangle, so if you have elif values rect, again, this wouldn't exist if we hadn't selected the draw rectangles option. We're going to create a bunch of temporary rectangles, right? So we're going to say temporary rect equals graph.draw rectangle. Again, if you're confused about like the draw rectangle part, you can look at the other tutorial linked in the description, which kind of goes just into how to draw shapes on the canvas. Mouse down point. So our initial point, our current point, our end of drag point. Actually, I think I want to just call this current point because I think that's more clear. Current point. We'll just call this current point right here. Because it's kind of complicated because end of drag point kind of implies that we finished our action, which we haven't necessarily. So, and then we're going to say fill color equals green. Line color, so fill color equals green, line color equals red. So just to kind of show you that whole line right there, we're just going to write it like this. It's like that. So we've got mouse down point. Actually, I just want to kind of move this over here. So we've got mouse down point as our first parameter. Our current point where we are is our next parameter. We're going to fill it with green. We're going to have a line color red. And this temporary rectangle is just specifying basically these little rectangles. And once we create our once we create our final rectangle, that's just, once we just do like a mouse up, that just becomes a figure that's on our, that's just going to be on our graph element. So this temporary rectangle is while we haven't decided where to put it, until the point where we do actually draw that rectangle. When we finish, when our mouse goes up, that the last rectangle that we drew is going to be the one that remains in the graph element. And then we're going to have elif values erase. So this is when we want to erase something, which is actually probably the simplest one because we're just kind of getting rid of what we've got right here, or our current figure. So if values erase for figure, and figure is being dragged. So basically where our mouse currently is, whatever figure is there, we're going to do graph.delete figure. And then we're going to put the figure in there as a parameter. Now this figure variable right up here, again, this is corresponding to that. And it's actually just an integer, but PySimpleGUI detects that integer, finds the shape that it matches up to, and then deletes it or moves it or whatever it needs to do. So this is basically what happens before we pull the mouse up. So basically what we're going to do is, if we're moving something, we're going to keep moving it to whatever position our mouse is currently at, as specified by x diff and y diff. We're going to keep creating rectangles to show where we intend to draw a rectangle if we select the rectangle option. And eventually, once our mouse goes up, whatever last temporary rectangle was there, that's just going to be on our graph element. Same thing with moving stuff. And then we can also, if we've selected erase, we can just delete whatever figure our mouse is currently on. So then we're going to deal with elif event that ends with. So again, this kind of actually, so I took this from another tutorial. I'm not sure why they did this, but this basically specifies the event where we have graph and then we have an up string right after it. And that basically means, okay, so we've stopped our action. We're done creating the rectangle. We're done moving or whatever. And this is what happens now. So we're just going to say mouse down point equals none, because we're done dragging. We're done with whatever our current option. We're done with whatever our current action is. We're going to say current point equals none, because we are no longer clicking down, so we don't really have a current point. Is being dragged is false. We're not really dragging anything anymore. And temporary rect is none. We have a permanent rectangle that's on the graph element, but we no longer need or have any temporary rectangles because we're not creating one anymore. And then we're going to finish that off with window.close. And that's it. I hope that made somewhat sense. It's very complicated, and it's cool to be able to do this in PySimpleGUI. But I think equally it kind of shows limitations, right? Like if you want to do anything more complex than this and more quickly, probably better off using Pygame, which I'm probably going to expand to here soon. Anyways, let's go ahead and let's run this code. So this is like a demo right here. So let's go ahead and run this code and do some troubleshooting. Again, I like to do that because you guys will probably end up running into the same issues. It also helps me fix my code. Okay, so it says list indices must be integers or slices, not radio. Okay, so that's really weird. Give sg.radio. Maybe I should just change this to R. That's what it was. That's what I had initially, and that seemed to work quite well. Normally radio works because there are radio options. Actually, never mind. That's probably not what it is. Actually, right here, we need to have a comma. So if anything, that's going to be an issue. Let's just run that again. Okay, yeah, that's what it was. It wasn't that I had radio there. All right, so you've got this. Let's draw a rectangle. Ooh, current point is not defined. Okay, so yeah, I needed to change current point right up here. Cool. Okay, there we go. So now that is defined. Let's run that again. Draw rectangles. Okay, so that seems to work. Let's try erasing an item. Okay, that erased everything at that click, which was 2 shapes. And then move stuff. Well, let's draw a rectangle. Let's try to move it. Okay, that seems to work. So cool. All right, looks like all of that works. There are other like options for stuff you can do. So right here, I based this off another tutorial I found online, again, because there was no other way that I would have been able to figure out how to do this. And this one, so demo 3 is more in line with that. And I kind of left this here as part of the code, which I'm going to link in the description, because there are other options where you can clear everything in the canvas. You can move stuff kind of in layers, the back and front, or you can move all events. You can also create a line or create an individual point. And I'll leave that right here so you can kind of look at this code, which is written differently from what I did, slightly differently. And you can see how to do these different actions and then apply them to your own programs. Anyways, that was probably one of the most complicated tutorials I've created for PySimpleGUI. I hope you enjoyed it and found value in it. If you want to see more tutorials like this, especially related to tkinter or Django or web development with Flask, then please go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. Have a nice day.